In January of the year 1547, the most powerful man in England lay dying in the stifling and nauseating royal chamber. His body, once the embodiment of strength and beauty, had turned into a putrid mass of infected flesh. The stench was so unbearable that few courtiers could remain near him for more than a few minutes. Small insects were already devouring his festering wounds while the monarch was still alive. This man was Henry VIII, the king who turned England upside down, broke ties with the Catholic Church, beheaded his wives and political opponents, and who died literally rotting away while still alive. But how did this magnificent young prince, recognized as the hope of all England, turn into a dying monster? How did a gallant tournament knight and educated patron of the arts become an obese tyrant whose corpse exploded in his own coffin? To understand the terrible end of Henry VIII, we must return to the beginning of this tragic and fascinating story, a story of love, power, betrayal, and the most terrible physical and moral decline ever known to a European monarch. He was born on June 28, 1491. Henry Tudor was not originally destined to ascend the throne. He was the second son of King Henry VII and lived constantly in the shadow of his older brother Arthur, who had been groomed for the kingdom since infancy. While Arthur received an intensive education to govern the state, the young Henry was initially prepared for a career in the church. However, fate had other plans. Arthur's early death in 1502, the victim of a mysterious illness, possibly English sweating sickness or tuberculosis, changed everything. Suddenly, at the age of 10, Henry became heir to the English throne. The loss of his brother had a profound effect on the young prince. Throughout his life, Henry was obsessed with the fear of death and the desire to establish a strong dynasty. This obsession shaped every decision he made, from his marriages to his foreign policy, and ultimately led to his physical and mental decline. When he finally ascended the throne in 1509, barely 17 years old, Henry seemed like a hero from a medieval knight's tale. Tall for his time, at about 5 feet 9 inches, he was impressively built, with broad shoulders, bright red hair, and a presence that dominated any room he entered. Foreign ambassadors described the young monarch as the ideal Renaissance prince, athletic, intelligent, and charming. A Venetian observer wrote that His Majesty was the most handsome man one could meet. Fluent in Latin, French, and Spanish, he composed music, wrote poetry, loved hunting, and excelled at tournaments. Records from that time describe a man with boundless energy who rose at dawn to hunt, could dance all night at court balls, and still found time for intellectual discussions with leading European thinkers. His first act as king was to marry Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his brother Arthur. The Spanish princess was 5 years his senior, but the marriage seemed promising for the Tudor dynasty. As the daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, the same Isabella who financed Columbus's voyages, Catherine provided England with an important alliance with the leading European power of the time. No one could have imagined that this alliance would be the first step toward an unprecedented religious revolution and a series of decisions that would change not only England, but the very body of the king. In the early years of his marriage to Catherine, Henry remained a brilliant and gallant prince. The English court became a center of culture and splendor. On the battlefield, the young king personally led his troops in battles against France, conquering the city of Tournai in 1513, a feat that filled him with pride. In 1520, during a diplomatic meeting with Francis III in France, known as the Field of Cloth of Gold, Henry impressed all of Europe with his pomp and physical prowess. The two monarchs competed in tournaments, wrestling and archery, where Henry demonstrated his outstanding physical abilities. However, behind this outward glory and success, darkness began to grow in the heart of Henry's reign. After many years of marriage, the king faced a critical problem: the lack of a male heir. Catherine suffered several miscarriages, and of her 6 children, only Princess Mary survived childhood. For a king obsessed with his lineage and haunted by the fear of death, this was completely unacceptable. The Tudor dynasty was still too young, having begun only with Henry's father after the bloody War of the Roses. Without a son, Henry feared that after his death, the country would once again be plunged into civil war. This growing anxiety coincided with noticeable but subtle changes in his behavior. Foreign ambassadors began to note his irritability, his tendency to hold grudges, and his growing distrust of even his closest advisors. By the age of 30, the king had begun to put on weight, although he still retained much of his energy and vitality. In the midst of this dynastic crisis, Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting to the queen, appeared on the scene. Unlike her sister Mary, who was already the king's mistress, Anne was different: intelligent, seductive, and extremely ambitious. Educated in the refined French courts, she arrived in England bringing with her new fashions, religious reform ideas, and a confidence that immediately set her apart from the other ladies of the court. Her olive skin, black hair, and dark eyes contrasted with the fair-haired beauty ideal of the time, but her magnetic personality quickly won Henry's attention. Unlike the other women the king had courted, Anne flat out refused to be just another mistress. She wanted the crown, nothing less. For 6 years, she kept the king at a distance, denying him the love he craved. This unprecedented tactic only fueled Henry's obsession. He wrote her dozens of passionate letters, some of which have survived to this day, revealing a man completely consumed by desire. "If you remember my passion," he wrote, "you cannot fail to acknowledge my constant pain." In another letter, he called her "my steadfast secretary," an indecent pun for the time. By the time Henry reached the age of 40 and was becoming increasingly desperate both for Anne and for a male heir, he took a decision unprecedented in European history. He broke with Rome and the Catholic Church in order to annul his marriage to Catherine. When Pope Clement VII refused to grant a divorce, since Catherine was the aunt of the powerful Emperor Charles V, Henry began a series of legal and theological maneuvers that culminated in the creation of the Anglican Church. This period marked the beginning of Henry's true transformation. Previously praised as a just and balanced prince of the Renaissance, he began to show increasing tyranny. In 1532, he forced the English clergy to recognize him as the sole defender and supreme head of the Church in England. Those who resisted were silenced. Through threats, imprisonment, and ultimately execution, Henry forced even the most stubborn to submit to his will. His old friend, mentor, and Lord Chancellor Thomas More refused to recognize Henry as head of the Church and paid for it with his life. He was beheaded in 1535. In 1533, the king finally got rid of Catherine by declaring the marriage invalid and secretly married Anne, who was already pregnant. A few months later, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in an unprecedentedly lavish ceremony. However, the people remained loyal to the true Queen Catherine, considering Anne to be the king's mistress, or worse, a great harlot. This was followed by one of the largest transfers of property in English history and a complete transformation of society. Henry, who proclaimed himself the supreme head of the Anglican Church, began the liquidation of monasteries. Between 1536 and 1541, more than 800 religious institutions were closed, and their lands and treasures were confiscated by the state. These possessions, which constituted about a quarter of England's arable land, passed to the crown, which redistributed them among the loyal nobility, thus creating a new class of landowners interested in maintaining the break with Rome. Monks and nuns who resisted were subjected to cruel executions. In 1535, 3 abbots were hanged, dismembered, and their bodies were put on display as a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the royal will. Magnificent artistic treasures accumulated over centuries were melted down or sold. The only thing spared were the stained glass windows of the great cathedrals, not because of their aesthetic value, but because replacing them would have been too expensive. This institutionalized cruelty was accompanied by equally profound changes in the king himself. By 1536, Henry had suffered his first serious injury, a leg wound sustained in a tournament fall. Initially seemingly minor, the wound never fully healed and developed into a chronic ulcer that tormented him for the rest of his life, significantly affecting his physical and psychological condition. Meanwhile, his marriage to Anne Boleyn, which was supposed to solve all his problems, brought only new difficulties. Anne gave birth to a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, but was unable to provide Henry with the male heir he so desired. After 3 miscarriages and the king's disappointment in her domineering character, Anne's fate was sealed. In 1536, just 3 years after her coronation, Anne was accused of multiple acts of adultery, including incest with her brother George, as well as conspiring to murder the king. Modern historians believe that these charges were fabricated by Henry's new prime minister, Thomas Cromwell, who saw Anne as a political obstacle. The trial was a farce. Witnesses were coerced and tortured to extract confessions. Court musician Mark Smith confessed under torture to having had an affair with the Queen, as did 4 other men who were subsequently executed. Henry's behavior during this period shows how much his personality had changed. The man who had waited patiently for 6 years for Anne to be with him now coldly sentenced her to death. Moreover, while Anne awaited her fate in the Tower of London, Henry was already celebrating with his new mistress, Jane Seymour, a modest and submissive lady, the complete opposite of Anne. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded in the Tower of London by a special executioner from France, known for his skill with the sword, to ensure a quick and merciful death. Her last words testify to the dignity with which she met her end. "I come not to accuse, but to die, Henry." Henry did not even bother to provide a decent coffin for Anne's body. She was placed in a simple arrow box and hastily buried in the Tower Chapel. Only after Anne's execution did the king marry Jane Seymour. Such a quick change of spouse caused a scandal in European courts, but the king did not care about international opinion. Only one thing mattered to him: finally having a long-awaited male heir. During this period, Henry's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The man who once epitomized male beauty became almost unrecognizable. He gained a lot of weight, and according to records, by the age of 45, he weighed over 140 kilograms. A sore on his leg constantly festered and emitted such a strong odor that it could be smelled in neighboring rooms. To hide this, his chambers were regularly fumigated with incense and herbs, and servants were strictly forbidden to mention the smell on pain of death. Despite all his suffering, Henry experienced true happiness when, in October 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a healthy son, the future King Edward VI. Finally, the king had a male heir. However, the joy was short-lived. 12 days after giving birth, Jane died of postpartum fever. Henry was deeply devastated. She was the only one of his wives for whom he seemed to have felt lasting affection. He ordered her to be buried with the honors of a queen, and years later decided to be buried next to her. Henry VIII's path to physical decline is closely linked to his obsessions, and to understand him fully, one must consider his 6 marriages. After Jane's death, the king remained unmarried for 2 years. During this time, his prime minister, Thomas Cromwell, sought suitable marriage alliances. Meanwhile, the wound on his leg worsened, causing such severe pain that Henry was sometimes unable to move for days. Medieval medicine had no effective treatment for his condition. Fearing disobedience and loss of life, doctors prescribed useless and often harmful procedures. They smeared the wounds with foul-smelling poultices, regularly performed bloodletting, and prescribed absurd diets that only exacerbated his general condition. Modern medical historians believe that Henry had type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly metabolic syndrome, all exacerbated by an excessively high-calorie diet and a sedentary lifestyle due to his leg injury. In 1540, Cromwell arranged the king's fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves, a princess from a small Protestant German principality. Henry agreed to the union based on a flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein. However, when he met Anne in person, he was horrified by her appearance, which, in his opinion, differed greatly from the painting. He called her a Flemish mare and compared her to a mule in the worst sense of the word. The marriage remained a mere formality, and Henry immediately began looking for ways to annul it. Anne wisely did not resist the annulment, which took place just 6 months after the wedding. In return for her cooperation, she received generous terms: an estate and the title of Sister of the King. She was the only one of Henry's 6 wives to outlive him, dying of natural causes many years later. Thomas Cromwell was not so lucky. Unable to provide the king with an attractive wife and faced with a growing number of enemies at court, he was arrested on false charges of treason and heresy. On July 28, 1540, Cromwell was beheaded, the same punishment he had arranged for Anne Boleyn. On the same day that Cromwell was executed, Henry married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, was barely 16 or 17 when she married the king, who was already 49 at the time. The contrast between them was striking. She was young, energetic, and full of life, while he was obese, exuding a foul odor from his festering wounds, and had a quick temper. For Henry, Catherine was a return to his youth. He called her his rose without thorns and showered her with expensive gifts. But the significant age difference and the king's poor physical condition made the marriage difficult for the young queen. While Henry idolized her, Catherine maintained a relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a young courtier, probably with the help of Lady Redford, the sister-in-law of the late Anne Boleyn. When Catherine's infidelity and her previous relationships before marriage were revealed, Henry was devastated. His already aging heart suffered another blow. At first, he refused to believe the accusations, but when irrefutable evidence appeared, including love letters written by Catherine herself, his reaction was brutal. The young queen was imprisoned in the Tower of London, along with her alleged lovers and accomplices. Catherine begged for mercy in a desperate letter to Henry, but he completely ignored her. On February 13, 1542, the Rose Without Thorns was beheaded. Witnesses reported that she had to be literally carried to the scaffold. Such was the fear. She spent her last night practicing how to place her head under the sword to avoid awkward movements at the last moment. Thomas Culpeper and other alleged lovers were hanged, castrated, and dismembered, the traditional punishment for traitors. After these executions, Henry fell into a deep depression. His health deteriorated rapidly. Portraits from that time show a man who is unrecognizable compared to the young athlete he once was. His face, once handsome and thin, became puffy and red. His obesity reached such proportions that he required special reinforced chairs and beds. According to documents, it took 4 people and a mechanical device to move the king from one room to another. Constant pain made his character increasingly unpredictable. Court officials reported outbursts of rage over trifles. One ambassador wrote that crossing this king's path was more dangerous than encountering a hungry tiger. Servants were flogged for serving food at the wrong temperature. A court jester was nearly executed for a harmless joke about the king's smell. Despite clear signs of instability, in 1543, Henry married for the sixth and last time to the 30-year-old widow Catherine Parr, known for her intelligence and religious devotion. This marriage was apparently dictated more by the need for a nurse and companion than by passion or politics. Catherine took on the task of uniting the fragmented royal family, becoming the stepmother of Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. In the late 1540s, Henry's condition became truly dire. An ulcer on his leg turned into an open wound so large that the bone of his shin was visible. Foreign doctors were called in, but they were horrified and did not dare to challenge the ineffective methods of the English physicians. One of them noted in his diary that the king was slowly being poisoned by his own doctors, referring to the harmful procedures they prescribed for him. To ease the constant pain, Henry began to drink increasing amounts of strong wine and take doses of opium. These substances, combined with his deteriorating physical condition and possible brain damage caused by previous concussions in tournaments, led to increasingly unpredictable and paranoid behavior on Henry's part. His diet remained remarkably excessive until the end of his life. Records from the royal kitchen show daily meals that included numerous meat dishes, whole birds, elaborate pies, and huge quantities of wine and beer. A typical banquet for the king might include roast swan, peacock, deer, boar, and dozens of other dishes. Even in his final months, when he could barely move, Henry consumed at least 5,000 calories a day. In 1546, it became clear to everyone except, perhaps, the king himself that the end was near. Gangrene had set in on his leg, and the smell of decay was so strong that few could remain in his chambers. In moments of clarity between the pain and the medication, Henry worked on his will, settling the question of succession and the future rule during the minority of his son Edward, who was then only 9 years old. The courtiers, anticipating the king's imminent death, began to form factions and fight for influence over the young prince. 2 main groups emerged, one led by the Seymour family, relatives of the late Queen Jane, and the other by the Howard family to which Catherine Howard belonged. Despite his poor health, Henry retained enough clarity of mind to notice these political maneuvers. In a final act of cruelty and suspicion, he ordered the execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, on charges of ambition for the throne. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, escaped execution only because the king died on the eve of the scheduled date of execution. Henry's last days were unbearable torment. He could not sleep because of the pain, spent his nights screaming, sometimes suffering from hallucinations and calling out to people long gone. The smell of decaying flesh was so unbearable that only his most loyal servants and his wife, Catherine, dared to approach him. Even the doctors kept their distance, examining him briefly and then going out for some fresh air. On January 27th, 1547, realizing that the end was near, Henry asked to see Archbishop Cranmer. When he arrived, the king was too weak to speak, but when asked if he wished to die in the faith of Christ, he squeezed Cranmer's hand. This was his last communication. Shortly thereafter, he died at the age of 55, having spent 37 years on the throne. However, death did not put an end to the physical horrors. In accordance with tradition, Henry's body was embalmed for a state funeral. This procedure, primitive at the time, involved removing the internal organs and filling the body with herbs, spices, and preservatives. However, due to the king's extreme size and the advanced state of decomposition, the embalming was unsuccessful. The lead coffin containing the remains was placed in St. George's Chapel in Windsor, awaiting burial. During the night, gases formed inside the body and blew up the coffin, releasing fluids. In the morning, dogs were found in the chapel licking up the spilled liquids, a terrible and symbolic end for a man whose life was marked by excess and cruelty. The funeral took place on February 16th with the pomp and ceremony that Henry himself had planned. His body was finally buried next to Jane Seymour in St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where it remains to this day. The legacy of Henry VIII remains controversial. The young prince who promised a golden age for England turned into a paranoid tyrant whose final years were filled with suspicion, violence, and suffering. The England he left behind was unrecognizable, separated from Rome, and forever changed. England had a new state religion, and the aristocracy and monarchy, newly enriched by monastery lands and unprecedented powers, completely transformed the country. The irony is that despite Henry's obsession with producing a male heir, his most enduring legacy is linked to his daughters. Edward VI, the long-awaited son, ruled for only 6 years, dying of tuberculosis at the age of 15. After a brief and bloody civil war during the reign of Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who desperately tried to restore Catholicism, Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, came to power. Elizabeth, the daughter of a witch whom Henry had beheaded, ruled for 45 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, established England as a maritime power, and became the patroness of a cultural renaissance that gave birth to Shakespeare and the golden age of English theater. The great final paradoxical irony was that Henry's most significant legacy was associated with the woman he had sentenced to death and tried to erase from history. The life and death of Henry VIII is a grim reminder of how absolute power can destroy not only the soul, but also the body. The young prince, once admired by those around him, turned into a terrible tyrant, and his body, once the object of envy, became a perfect reflection of his rotting soul. His reign demonstrates how decisions made for personal reasons, divorce, remarriage, religious disputes, can change the course of history for entire nations. Almost 500 years have passed since his death, and Henry continues to fascinate historians and the general public. His 6 wives, his religious reforms, his transformation from a charming prince to a tyrant. All this creates an almost Shakespearean drama of rise and fall. But perhaps the most disturbing lesson of his story is a reminder that even the most powerful cannot escape the consequences of their excesses. A king who rotted away in life is a testament to the fragility of flesh, even for those who consider themselves above human laws.